Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've brewed around Camellia, the Seedmiser. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, but that doesn't include costs such as shipping. So, Camellia, the Seedmiser, is a 3/3 legendary squirrel warlock with menace, costing a generic, a black, and a green mana to cast, and giving our other squirrels menace, meaning that they can't be blocked by less than 2 creatures. Additionally, whenever you sack 1 or more foods, you make a 1/1 green squirrel creature token, and you can pay 2 generic and forage to put a +1/+1 counter on each other squirrel you control, with forage meaning that you either exile 3 cards in your graveyard, or you sack a food token. So this commander is pointing towards a fairly food-heavy focus to me, as those are the main fuel for our commander's abilities, where we're looking to get foods out and sacked through Camellia's forage costing ability to make and buff more squirrel tokens, though of course we can also exile stuff from our graveyard to do this. However, we're still going to want a decent number of squirrel creature spells and alternative sources of squirrel tokens, mostly to make widening our board faster than just relying on those foods alone, as Camellia will inherently give those creatures menace so long as she's on the board, and they'll make sacking our foods through Camellia even more valuable. So ultimately, we're looking to form a wide board of squirrels that's fairly difficult for an opponent to block entirely an assault from. But with that, let's get into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. First up, we have Rampant Growth, which has you tutor a basic land directly onto the battlefield tapped, and then Kodama's Reach and Cultivate tutor 2 basic lands, which you reveal, put 1 onto the battlefield tapped, and the other into your hand. Then Talisman of Resilience taps for generic, but could produce black or green mana at the cost of pinging yourself for 1, and Golgari Signet converts 1 mana into a black and a green mana. Then Felwar Stone is likely to tap for at least 1 of our colors, while Arcane Signet will tap for either of the colors that we need. And then we have Thorn Vault Forager as a squirrel mana dork that can easily produce green mana, but you can tap and forage to produce 2 mana of any combination of colors. And it can even be used as a tutor for squirrel cards. And finally for this section, Knight of the Sweet's Revenge lets us use our food tokens as green mana rocks, while also making a food token upon entering the battlefield. Now let's move on to the bulk of this deck with foods and food token generation. First up are Gingerbrute and Candy Trail as 1-drop food artifacts, the former being a 1/1 creature with haste that you can make a challenge for someone to block, and the latter having you scry 2 when it enters the battlefield. Then Lembas is a 2-drop food spell that has you scry 1 and draw a card when it enters the battlefield, but when it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield, it gets shuffled into its owner's library. And Tough Cookie is a 2-drop 2/2 food golem creature that also makes an additional food token when it enters the battlefield, and can turn a non-creature artifact into a 4/4 for the turn. Then for some non-permanent spells that also produce food tokens, Many Partings lets you tutor a basic land which you reveal and put into your hand, Revive the Shire lets you return a permanent card from the graveyard to your hand, and Shelob's Ambush gives a target creature +1/+2 and Death Touch for the turn, with each of these spells producing a food token after the rest of their effects. Then Brandywine Farmer and Vinereap Mentor make food tokens when they enter and leave the battlefield, though Vinereap Mentor needs to die specifically to get its exiting effect. Trail of Crumbs, Baker's Bane Duo, and Greta, Sweet Tooth Scourge each make a food token upon entering the battlefield, with Trail of Crumbs letting you pay 1 when you sack a food to look at the top 2 cards of your library, which you can reveal a permanent card from those, and put it into your hand, with the remainder going onto the bottom of your library in a random order. Baker's Bane Duo being a squirrel that gets +1/+1 for the turn when you spent your 4th mana casting spells that turn, and Greta gives you an alternative way to sack your foods, either to draw a card or to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. Killer Service makes as many food tokens as you have opponents when it enters the battlefield, and gives you the ability to sack a token at the start of your end step by paying 2 mana, and it'll make a 4/4 Rhino Warrior token, while Gilded Goose also makes a food token as it enters the battlefield, but can be tapped with 2 mana to make a food token. Then Giant Skewer is an equipment that gives its equipped creature +2/+1, and makes a food token when the equipped creature deals combat damage to a creature, sort of making it a win-win as you either get through on an opponent, or you make a food token to buff and make more squirrels with. Savvy Hunter is a 3/3 that makes a food token whenever it attacks or blocks, and then Tireless Provisioner either makes a food or treasure token when a land enters the battlefield under your control. Pippin, Warden of Isengard, can be tapped with 1 mana to produce a food token, and Peregrine Took has it whenever you make 1 or more tokens, you'll also make an additional food token. But let's move on to our squirrel token generators, and the majority of the squirrels that I haven't already mentioned. Squirrel Nest enchants a land and lets you tap that land to make a 1/1 squirrel creature token, while Chitter Spitter can be tapped with a green mana to make a 1/1 squirrel creature token, while giving you the option to sack a token on your upkeep to put an Acorn counter on Chitter Spitter, of which your squirrels get +1/+1 for each Acorn counter on Chitter Spitter. Chatterfang, Squirrel General, is a squirrel that has it so whenever you make 1 or more tokens, you'll also make a 1/1 squirrel token. Then Honored Dray Leader is a 1/1 with trample that gets a +1/+1 counter for each other squirrel and or food you control when it enters the battlefield, and it gets a +1/+1 counter whenever another squirrel or food enters the battlefield under your control. Ravenous Squirrel gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you sack an artifact or creature, while giving you a sack outlet for artifacts and creatures that has you gain life and draw a card. And Valley Rockcaller is a squirrel with menace that has each opponent lose X life and you gain X life whenever it attacks, with X being the number of other squirrels, bats, lizards, or rats you control. And Hazel's Brewmaster also has menace and lets you exile a card from any graveyard and make a food token whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, and gives your foods all activated abilities of creature cards exiled through Hazel's Brewmaster. Now I'd like to go through a handful of cards that have useful effects, but don't fit super well into any one chapter. This includes Branching Evolution and Hardened Scales, the former having you put twice as many +1/+1 counters on a creature you control that you normally would, and the latter having you put an extra +1/+1 counter on a creature you control whenever you're putting that type of counter on your creatures. Sword of the Squeak is an equipment that gives its equipped creature +1/+1 for each creature you control with a base power and toughness of 1/1, and it can be auto-equipped whenever a squirrel, or mouse, rat, or hamster enters the battlefield under your control. Then Trample might still be useful in case our opponents do wish to block our menacing squirrels, so I've put Duskshell Crawler and Overrun into this deck, the former giving creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them trample, and the latter giving all your creatures +3/+3 and trample for the turn. But let's start digging into the draw spells that'll help keep us from top decking. Sign in Blood, Night's Whisper, and Foreboding Fruit are sorceries that have you, or a target player, draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, while Foreboding Fruit also has you make a food token if 3 black mana were spent to cast it. Deadly Dispute and Eviscerator's Insight have you draw 2, but require you to sack a creature or artifact to cast along with its mana cost, though the former also has you make a treasure token and the latter has flashback to cast it from the graveyard later on. Harmonize simply has you draw 3 cards, and Shamanic Revolution has you draw cards equal to the number of creatures you control, while Inspiring Call has you draw for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it, and giving those creatures indestructible for the turn, which could be useful to get some of your creatures out of the line of fire of a destroy effect. Then, given this is a token-centric deck, Idol of Oblivion should give you access to a fairly consistent draw, as it can be simply tapped to draw, provided you made a token that turn. And then Bone Cache Overseer is a squirrel that can be tapped while paying 1 life to draw, provided 3 or more cards left your graveyard, or you sacked a food that turn, which foraging with our commander, or any of our other creatures, should meet that requisite. Deepwood Denizen has a tap ability to draw, but costing 5 generic and a green to activate, but that generic cost gets reduced by 1 for each +1/+1 counter on creatures you control. Stocking the Pantry gets a supply counter whenever you put 1 or more +1/+1 counters on a creature you control, and then you can pay 2 and remove a supply counter from Stocking the Pantry to draw a card. And then the Odd Acorn Gang is a squirrel that has you draw a card whenever 1 or more squirrels you control deal combat damage to a player, while itself having Menace, Trample, and Reach, and giving squirrels you control the ability to be tapped to give a target squirrel +2/+2 and trample for the turn at sorcery speed. Tusky, Bearer of Secrets, is a squirrel that can't be countered, has indestructible, and attacks whenever able, but also has it so whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. And finally, Phyrexian Arena is a solid way to get more draw as, at the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card and lose 1 life. But now let's move on to the spells that we can use to interact with what our opponents are doing. Feed the Swarm lets us destroy an opponent's creature or enchantment, though we lose life equal to its mana value. Then Doomblade and Go for the Throat let you destroy a target non-black and non-artifact creature, respectively. Stew the Conies and Spider Food each make food tokens while being interaction spells, the former having a creature we control deal damage equal to its power to a creature we don't control, and the latter letting you destroy a target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. Return to Nature lets you either destroy a target artifact, target enchantment, or exile a target card from a graveyard. And Canker Bloom is a 3/2 creature that can be sacked to destroy a target artifact, enchantment, or you could proliferate to get more counters on your squirrels. And then for a couple of board wipes, we have Azuri's Predation and Swarmyard Massacre, the former making a 4/4 beast creature token for each creature your opponents control, and then having each beast fight a different creature for kind of a weenies board wipe. And then the latter makes 2 1/1 squirrel tokens and then gives -1/-1 to each creature that isn't an insect, rat, spider, or squirrel for each creature you control that is one of those 4 creature types. But now that we've gone through all the spells in this deck, let's go over our land base. Starting with our land tutor lands, Shire Terrace and Promising Vein can be tapped for generic, or it can be sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, while Myriad Landscape can be sacked to tutor 2 basic lands of the same type onto the battlefield tapped. Then for Golgari lands, we have Necroblossom Snarl, which can enter the battlefield untapped if you reveal a swamp or forest from your hand, and Viridescent Bog converts 1 mana into a black and green mana. And then for straight tapped lands, we have Jungle Hollow as a life gain land, Temple of Malady as a scry land, and Golgari Rot Farm as a bounce land. Then Gingerbread Cabin and the Shire are lands that can produce some food tokens. The former if it enters the battlefield when you already control 3 or more other forests, and the latter needing to be tapped with 2 mana and tapping an untapped creature you control. But aside from that, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 10 basic swamps and 15 basic forests. But now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing just under $45 at the time of recording, which does include our basic lands at 10 cents each, but it doesn't include costs such as shipping. Now I'd like to quickly mention a handful of cards that you may wish to consider if you're wanting to upgrade this deck with a bit higher budget. Nuka-Cola Vending Machine is definitely a pricey card when considering this deck, but it would provide you with a pretty consistent source of foods across turns, and given we already have many extra sources of food tokens in this deck outside of the vending machine, you'd be making a ton of treasure tokens as well for extra mana. Experimental Confectioner would basically double up our creature token generation, as you'd be making a 1/1 black rat creature token that can't block anytime you sack a food, while Camellia is out there making squirrels. Hazel of the Rot Bloom can act as a decent form of ramp, and is also a squirrel, but the main driver to me is that at your end step, you can copy a target token that you control, but you make 2 copies if the token you're copying is a squirrel, which could really help widen the board. Nut Collector acts as both a source of squirrel tokens, letting you make one at the beginning of your upkeep, while also being a +2/+2 squirrel anthem if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard. Second Harvest has the potential to explode your token count depending on your board state when it's cast, as it makes a copy of each token you control. And if you're looking for another potential source of trample, Overwhelming Stampede is a solid choice, giving your creatures trample and +X/+X for the turn, with X being the highest power of creatures you control, and might be a solid replacement for something like Duskshell Crawler. But I should close out this video, so if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider dropping it a like, and consider subbing if you'd like to see more budget decks in your feeds. Regardless, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.